Hi, this is Rabbi Marc Katz from Temple near Tamid in Bloomfield, New Jersey. In this week's portion, Parshat Eikev, we have one of the most famous lines in our tradition. In it, God is called Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanorah, a great, mighty, and awesome God. Now, this line is important not necessarily because of how it describes God, but because it is so concise. And throughout our tradition, our ancestors have played with that translation, not only by trying to understand what these words mean, but more importantly, to understand if it's okay to add words or take words away from it. So I want to tell you two quick tales that play around with this line as a better way to understand our relationship to the words that we use to describe God. The first is that calling God great, mighty, and awesome is fine. But what happens when bad things happen in the world? Well, that exact question was asked by our rabbis. And they imagined that after the temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, Jeremiah, one of the great prophets of the Jewish tradition, decided that he could no longer call God Norah, or awesome. Now, a few generations later, the Jews are now, instead of calling God great, mighty, and awesome as they pray, taking those words from Deuteronomy, they're just calling God great and mighty. But then Daniel comes around, and he sees Jews who are exiled in his day, and he decides that he can no longer call God mighty. And so now God is just great. And for generations that continued, until a group of people called the Men of the Great Assembly observed their world, and they decided to put back those two adjectives. They understood that although Jeremiah and although Daniel didn't want to describe God using the words that God had described God's self in the Torah, it made sense to use them. And God once again became great, mighty, and awesome. And that's the way that we, in many of our prayers, describe God. Now, counter to that, a tale of taking God's names away, or descriptors away, we have another tale in the Talmud about a rabbi who stands before Rabbi Hanina, and he starts talking about God. And he uses additional adjectives. He starts calling God great, mighty, and awesome, and then he adds a few more. Holy, worthy of praise, blessed, until finally, after he's done praying, Rabbi Hanina says, look, we have no right to call God those names. We don't know if God, in fact, deserves those dignifiers. What we do know is that God uses 3 in the Torah, and we should mimic those. Now, these two stories show the process that we often engage in, which is a process called theology. A process whereby we try our hardest to try to explain who God is, what God is, the essence of God, and how God belongs in the world. And we play with language to do that. But the problem with playing with language is that often that process is incredibly disingenuous. I mean, if you think about it, we can do anything with language. Many of us know the paradox of omnipotence, for example, the idea of a God who can do everything. And then the question is asked, if God can really do everything, can God build a rock so big that even God couldn't lift it? Now, if you take these questions to their logical conclusion, you realize they make no sense. If God can do everything, God could make a rock that God couldn't lift. But then again, God couldn't do everything if God couldn't lift that rock. The problem with theological posturing is that language is inherently limited, which is what our ancestors understood. It's why, for example, Maimonides says that the only way to truly describe God is to say not what God is, but what God isn't. So what can we learn from this? That the process that our ancestors engaged in and the reluctance that they had to use words to describe God, ultimately, more than anything else, is a struggle that we have today. And we can play with words and try theology all we want. But at the end of the day, the key is not theology, but religious experience. Something that Rabbi Harold Kushner once said, he quipped, that if theology is like reading a menu, religious experience is like eating dinner. Yes, our goal should be to describe what God is in the world around us, But as our ancestors showed us, adding and taking away ultimately is a flawed process. Our goal is to live in the world. Our goal is to experience the great, the mighty, and the awesome nature of God. Not necessarily to describe it, but to imbue our world with it, to imbibe it, and more importantly, to observe and live it.